Thank you, President, and I thank the Senate for giving me a 10-minute contribution during this afternoon's adjournment debate. I missed out on speaking on the bill this morning in relation to electricity infrastructure legislation amendment, which is essentially a bill on offshore wind, a technical legislative change. The Greens support offshore wind renewable rollout. Of course, we want this done properly. We're very focused on making sure we have the right processes in place for that. Now, I met with the department, President, a couple of years ago. In fact, I met with them on numerous occasions to ask them how they were going to be rolling out their offshore wind projects and the consultation processes around that. And I remember being alarmed at the model that they were going to use, very similar to what we see that NOPSEMA currently manages as regulator, where zones are permitted, companies can come along and apply for licences, and then if you get a licence, then you go through an environmental impact statement, community consultation, and then if you get to the end of the road, you can proceed with your offshore wind farm project. And many of the offshore wind zones may not be looking at established projects till potentially the 2030s. And it wasn't so much the licence process that I was concerned about, although we also want to make sure it's extremely rigorous and that wind farms are put in the right place and they have minimal impacts. I was concerned about the social licence for these projects. As I said to the department, if you leave it 5 or 10 years and you leave it to these big companies that are going to manage the wind farm process, you may well lose your social licence, because there is an incredible amount of disinformation out there already about these wind farms. And that's what I want to talk about today, and I'm glad Senator Scarr's in the chamber today. He gets to hear part two of how we have a global disinformation, a very organised, very deceitful, very dishonest global disinformation campaign underway in relation to offshore wind farms. Senator Scarr, you can spend your 5 minutes responding to me as you did the other night. I'd be very happy to see that. President, right now before the Senate Environment and Communications Committee there is a Senate inquiry on the offshore wind consultation process. And there's a very important contribution from Professor Jeremy Walker from UTS, where he's written a paper for the Senate and he's outlining these disinformation campaigns and how they've worked in the US and how they're now being unfolded here in Australia. And there's also some really good research there from the US. Now, and I'd urge all Australians who are interested in this and interested in democracy to go onto the Environment and Comms website and have a look at these public submissions themselves. Now, he finishes his contribution, his 14 pages that he wrote for the Senate, saying the systemic disruption of offshore wind consultation processes by disinformation and astroturfing, the targeting of Australian local councils and state and federal parliaments is part of a foreign influence campaign, traceable through local actors to powerful, highly organised, far-right forces bent on preventing democratic governments from protecting their constituents from the catastrophic consequences of the fossil fuel industry. We ignore at our gravest peril the fossil sector's shadowy Atlas network, its disinformation assault on clean energy all around the world, on the integrity of our public sphere and democratic institutions and processes. And he's put some meat on the bones in terms of this conclusion in his submission to the Senate. I've already talked about the Atlas network this week, but for those who aren't aware, and the thing is, Australians, you talk to them about this and they haven't heard about it. And I must confess, I didn't really know a huge amount about it myself till I did some research on it recently. They've done a really good job flying on the radar, which is quite amazing considering this US group has 550 global affiliates, all designed to try and prevent action on climate change and progress their conservative agendas and line the pockets of some of their big donors. And we've got some pretty high-profile subsidiaries here in Australia. He talks about the global infrastructure of these think tanks driving disinformation and opposition to clean energy and climate policy since 1988. He said they've been targeting community consultations, council, state and federal elections in Australia, particularly in relation to offshore wind farms. Now, it's really interesting research that is attached that traces back to the US. And as he says, as has been clearly demonstrated by research published by the Climate Policy Development Lab at Brown University, Rhode Island, USA, and numerous articles in the US press, the proliferation of Save the Whales from Wind Farm articles and memes were first propagated by the Heartland Institute, the Caesar Rodney Institute and the Texas Public Policy Foundation, each of which are or have been listed by the Atlas Network as affiliated organisations, and each with amply documented histories of fossil fuel-derived funding, including from ExxonMobil, the co-foundations, Chevron and Alcoa subsidiaries. And there's a lot more information in his submission about that. He said, Atlas operatives working within these institutes assisted in catalysing the formation of anti-offshore wind community groups near offshore wind zones, mobilising community anger against wind farm projects on false claims, widely circulated on pop-up Facebook groups that wind farms are causing whale deaths, and setting up anti-wind campaign websites, often disguised in the language of environmental NGOs. The intentional creation and fostering of ostensibly grassroots political action groups by strategic communication experts is termed astroturfing, intended to convey superficial authenticity to what are in fact highly professional PR disinformation campaigns. And if you have a look at the lengths that these organisations have gone to deceive communities, it's quite extraordinary. And I've got to say, I've been a campaigner for 20 years and I've got to show some grudging respect to the resources and the lengths these people have gone to deceive not just Americans but Australians globally about the wind farm, the use of wind farms. There's, for example, and it's all provided in this really amazing map, these astroturfing groups include the Save the Right Whales group in the US with its own website, or the Green Oceans group, or the Coalition for Ocean Protection, not to mention the Environmental Progress Group. Go on and have a look yourself. These fake groups set up by the Atlas Network and their subsidiaries are quite extraordinary. Now, has it infiltrated Australia? Unfortunately, yes, it has. The articles, memes and false claims that wind kills whales generated since 2023 by Atlas think tanks and spin-off community anti-wind farm groups on the US East Coast are now widely circulating in Australia anti-wind farm groups, not to mention the Facebook pages of a few senators in this chamber, may I say, cloaking pro-fossil fuel industry narratives in the language of environmental and community concern by slick anonymous websites, a method identical to the tactics used by the US branch of anti-offshore wind network. Much of the groundwork organisation of this anti-offshore wind campaign in Australia appears to be conducted by secretive strategic communications experts. And he actually lists some of the people directly involved in this here in Australia. For example, counts in the language and imagery of environmental concern, websites such as No Offshore Wind Turbines, Responsible Futures Illawarra, Australians Against Offshore Wind and their associated Facebook groups are notably silent on the catastrophic impacts of global fossil fuels, but they're out there saying that wind farms kill whales and they're environmentally unfriendly. And he actually names up a number of individuals, including Burchell Wilson and others who are behind these groups that have got long established histories with US Atlas-affiliated think tanks, trained in the US, almost certainly funded by these think tanks in the US. And it's going to be really interesting, President, if we don't get a chance in this Senate inquiry to call these people as witnesses and interrogate their links to these international groups and these awful disinformation campaigns that are slowing down the rollout of renewable energy in this country and elsewhere, on behalf of their big fossil fuel donors through these shady, dodgy, secretive networks. If we don't get a chance to in this Senate inquiry, then I would suggest to the Senate that in the next parliament we need a much more substantial inquiry into who's behind these disinformation campaigns. Now, I hope you do come, Senator, I hope you do. I'll tell you what, we had a bill for disinformation to deal with disinformation in this parliament, and it didn't succeed. The Greens weren't supportive of the current framework, but I think we actually got it asked about. I think we need to do it the other way. We actually need to look at who's spreading this disinformation first, understand the lay of the land, and then look at what laws we need in place to prevent this kind of dishonest rhetoric. And it is a target at the heart of democracy and at the heart of climate action and all those who care about our planet.
Thank you, Senator Whish-Wilson.